Anime has seen an explosion of popularity in recent years, with shows like Attack on Titan, My Hero Academia, and Demon Slayer reaching mainstream Western audiences in a way that very few others had ever reached before. With this massive burst in recognition, we now see what elevates these shows from their manga counterparts being spoken of more frequently: the animation, voice acting, and most importantly to me, their soundtracks. And in recent years, one show has overcome several of these in its rapid expansion of global recognition, and that show is You Are My Spaceship. Jujutsu Kaisen first season released in 2021, and since has become a global phenomenon, taking anime fans and newcomers alike by storm. There are several key factors to this. The show's modern setting, fun and dynamic characters, and entertaining humor all serve it well, but the one thing that drives this show the most is the action. In this video, we're going to talk about Jujutsu Kaisen using its soundtrack to elevate its action scenes, and how the musical form of these tracks not only complements the scenes they were created for, but enhance them to new heights. JJK's first season has 3 different composers, each bringing their own unique musical flair and spins to the show. We're going to observe how these 3 different composers bring their own style to 3 of their songs, that I believe best demonstrate their individual touches on what makes the show's soundtrack so great. To do this, we'll break down the 3 action scenes in the show's first season that I believe best mix the use of the show's soundtrack with the action surrounding it. Yoshimasa Terui is the composer of the first track we're observing for this video. He is a guitarist and composer, as well as the founder of math rock pop group Haishu no Nasa. With his work on the Jujutsu Kaisen soundtrack, he utilizes a great deal of jazz-like chromaticism and improvisation, combining traditional Japanese instruments and familiar rock and roll, both of which are common to the anime music genre. This can be easily seen not only on his tracks featured on this soundtrack, but can also be clearly seen on his work as the solo composer of Jujutsu Kaisen's second season as well. Yoshimasa's work on the series is one of brilliant character themes, and many of his tracks are associated with some of the most character-defining moments in the show's premiere season. For example, the track Working Overtime first plays in the 11th episode of the first season, titled Narrow-Minded. The track plays at the very beginning of the episode and starts as Kento Nanami begins to introduce his specific pact, Overtime. This piece, while extremely complimentary for the scene it's present in, also very clearly serves as Nanami's character theme. It's incredibly erratic and fast-paced, which is ironic considering Nanami himself is a very deliberately cold and calculating character. I do, however, find this to be incredibly complimentary for the character, as Nanami is a character who is filled with rage just bubbling beneath the surface. The piece as a whole is written in a strophic form, with a defined A section that is repeated twice, a contrasting B section, and then a return of the A section once more. The A section itself is made up of a 16-bar phrase which repeats the same melody twice, adding in more support instrumentals as it goes on their own separate melody lines above the original melody. The bridge section follows a Monte progression, where the piano keys are playing continuously rising and modulating chords underneath an impressionistic guitar solo. And then the return to the A section begins with a different instrument taking the melody and lowering it an octave before transitioning to the original instrumentation for a closing return to the A section extended by one singular measure. The song sounds incredibly complex on a first listen, but once we start to observe and inspect how the different instruments are layered onto each other and introduced into the piece, it starts to become shockingly simple. Now let's observe how the track is used in the scene in the show. The soundtrack is cued in by Nanami's words,
"Thanks to you, I'm going to have to go into overtime."
The initial use of the song in the show shortens and alters the A section from the piece slightly to better flow with the pace of the conversation in the scene. For the purposes of our analysis, we'll call this section of the music the introduction. The jumping melody played throughout is representative of the cursed energy now overflowing through Nanami and the acceleration of it. This section comes to a close in the scene as Nanami begins to explain his technique. The second section of this piece we'll call the explanation. The Monte Bridge section we described previously is featured as Nanami begins to go into further detail explaining his technique, getting into the specifics of it, elevating the key as he adds on more and more details to it. The drum beat that occurs at the end of this section shows that he is now finished speaking and prepares for the third and final section that I call the action. This drum solo can almost be seen as the siren that blares at the beginning of a race. From here, Nanami bursts into action, speeding through the room, and as his initial melody returns, each of the musical instruments featured on the piece join in as we finally get into the most chaotic and action-packed portion of the scene and the song. Finally, as Nanami's thoughts come together, he leaps into the air, punching through the wall and bringing rubble crashing down on his opponent. As he does, the vocalist sings her last riff, and the fight and song end. The second of the three composers we will be discussing is Elisa Okehazama. Elisa is, in my opinion, the most diverse of the three composers on the soundtrack in terms of how different each of her pieces sound. From upbeat and jaunty rock and roll grooves, emotional and somber music moments, and most interestingly, unique and erratic EDM. Elisa Okehazama brings to life several of the most impactful moments of Jujutsu Kaisen's first season, but the one that we're going to be observing is... The song Hollow Purple comes from the most impressive showing of power demonstrated at this point in the series, by what we the audience have already clearly come to understand as the most powerful character in the series, Satoru Gojo. Hollow Purple as a track really sells the idea that Gojo is more of a monster than a hero, even though we've come to appreciate him as the former. The track uses fantastic mixing of traditional Japanese instrumentation with modern electronic music. This crossover of musical genres demonstrates the crossover of ancient supernatural Japanese spiritualism and the modern aesthetics that are already so heavily implemented into Jujutsu Kaisen's soul. This same mixing of traditional Japanese spiritualism and modern aesthetics is one that's also featured on the tracks for the villains of the show, the Cursed Spirits. It's interesting that we now see this used to represent Gojo, not only our hero, but the hero. This track is in a rondo form, albeit a bit of a messy one. Whereas your typical rondo form is understood as A-B-A, C-A-B-A, Hollow Purple instead takes it as A-B-A, C-D, B-A. Removing the one extra A section, the final B and A sections are also lightning fast, blink and you miss it moments due to the song's ever-increasing tempo as the track goes on. The track is featured late into the show's 20th episode, Non-Standard, and serves as the climactic moment in the Kyoto Sister School Exchange event arc. I've dubbed this first section of the music, Gojo Arrives. The slow-paced build-up begins as each of the characters begin to realize Gojo's own arrival on the battlefield and what that means. The B section, or as I like to call it, Gojo's analysis, begins as soon as Gojo himself begins to analyze the situation and take low-effort action, disarming one of the enemy sorcerers. The return of the A section begins as Gojo once again begins to strategize and analyze the situation as it continues to evolve. The build-up from the beginning is now accompanied by his internal monologue. The C section begins as we cut back to where the main focal point of the action had been, Yuji and Todo facing off against Hanami. I like to dub this section, Charge. As Hanami realizes Gojo has arrived, she immediately begins to retreat, and this section of the music comes to a close as Todo tells Yuji,
それ以上進むな巻き込まれるぞ
The show edits the track to fade out as we, the audience, are back far away from the action, watching the destruction unfold ahead of us. When the music does come back, the initial dance break, or D section, featured in the soundtrack version is missing. Instead, we hear the revamped B section as we follow the blast from a close point of view. The A section then once again returns as the dust begins to settle on the battlefield, and Gojo has won.
Yay!
The third and final song we'll be analyzing is composed by none other than Hiroki Tsutsumi. Tsutsumi's work is by far the most rock and hip-hop influenced, with his works being the ones which feature rap artists or vocalists from other bands the most often. However, he's also responsible for some of the soundtrack's most unique and cinematic sounding songs as well. He also makes the best usage of motifs across multiple songs, specifically across what I've labeled his Aoi Todo trilogy. But I think that Hiroki Sutsumi's best track, and also the track that demonstrates all of the qualities that I believe the soundtrack of a TV show should do the best, is none other than... Featuring the lead singer of the metal band Cold Rain, Remember is not only an electric, blood-pumping piece for the scene it's involved in, but I also believe it to be the perfect example of what a TV show soundtrack should do for the scenes they accompany. I cannot listen to this song without the scene playing out beat for beat in my head. Each musical shift, each dramatic moment, and we'll get to the big one in just a second. Even the matching of the drum beats to the punches being thrown just make this song not only a decoration to the scene itself, but a massive reason the scene even works at all. The piece has no true form to it, but it's rather a through-composed rock piece, similar to Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody or even Je by Claude Debussy. Ultimately, this piece has multiple sections, and we'll address each one specifically as it matches the flow of the scene. We'll establish the sections as prelude, verse, interlude, bridge, chorus, postlude. The song opens with the prelude as crowd-like chants, hand claps, and a bass electric guitar establish a steady melody. I've nicknamed this section Won't Stop after the dialogue that Nobara Kugisaki speaks in narration. As the lead vocalist enters, as well as the lead guitar making the underlying melody a bit more defined, we hear narration from Nobara, explaining to us how Yuji is able to move despite his being infected by the poison. This section carries us through a quick visual flashback of the last time that Yuji had shrugged off poison in a fight, fittingly I find, as the words "remember" are sung in the background. As we return to the action at hand, Yuji begins his onslaught on the villains, with his first two initial punches being perfectly matched to the heavy pedal featured in the drums and lead guitar. Then, as the prelude comes to a close and Yuji's punches begin to accelerate, so too do the drums and guitar, and we are now fully into the song. The verse, as I call the onslaught, features a heavy rap metal vocalist over an electric rock and roll beat. As our heroes begin to lay pressure onto the villains, the music has a distortion effect, reminiscent of the disoriented state that our villains are in. This is the shortest section of the song by far, but it establishes a clear pattern of the modern age rock and roll instrumentals as the representation of our heroes in this song. Suddenly, the pace of the song shifts, as does the audience perspective in the show. As the audience begins to hear our villain Kechizu's inner thoughts on the battle, the instrumentation of the piece shifts to more classical string instruments. The mood of the piece also shifts greatly, showing the differences of perspectives for our heroes and villains. Whereas our heroes are celebrating a heartfelt battle where they barely survived, our villains are facing the tragic reality of death, and the instrumentation for their perspective represents that fully. As Kechizu's mind races for a strategy, we hear that guitar and drums begin sneaking their way back in, reminding the audience of the pressure that our heroes are placing onto the villain. Just as Kechizu seems to reach his conclusion, all of the instruments fade out, and we are left with a short piano interjection. The tears of his brother. And then the battle begins to reach a climax. Suddenly we are back in our hero's perspective, and the rock anthem is fully swinging for the bridge. The guitar and drums carry the melody through a fast-paced motion, and we, the audience, can feel the tension ramping up as the vocals begin to implement more of those powerful sustained notes. But now, the strings are still subtly underneath the main melody, reminding the audience that this battle has more than just the one perspective that we're following. Of course, this goes all the way as the piece reaches its climax, and as each heavy beat of the drum and strum of the guitar is met with a switch between the two intense, terrifying expressions of our heroes, the music comes to a halt, and then... The chorus begins with an absolute hammer of a moment, and the strings become much more pronounced as our heroes begin to secure victory. The chant-like vocals in the background return as the battle begins to draw to a close, and Nobara finishes off her opponent finally. Then we enter the postlude as the battle and song begin to reach a close, and that piano medley returns, playing a soft, saddening melody, which is sharply contrasted by the triumphant rock anthem playing over it. Remember is my personal favorite track on the Jujutsu Kaisen soundtrack. It takes a scene that on paper shouldn't be all that monumental or memorable and turns it into a thrilling, emotional, and turbulent season finale. This scene is magnificent and is a perfect example of the kind of storytelling that Jujutsu Kaisen is known for, and its music is what makes it anywhere near as impactful as it is. The music of Jujutsu Kaisen is truly incredible, and we far from covered all of the fantastic tracks that were composed for not only this soundtrack, but the phenomenal work that was done on the second season's soundtrack as well. However, my hope today is that in our discussion of the music for the show in these three scenes, it'll encourage you to look more closely not just at the music for Jujutsu Kaisen and other anime, but the soundtracks for all movies and television that you watch in the future. The score for a visual story such as these is so incredibly important and vital to the storytelling involved, but it's often overlooked both as a factor into what makes these experiences so great, and just the marvelous works of composition that they are on their own. If you've made it this far through the video, I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you some other time.